Good morning, everyone. It is I, Ken Shorgen, along with the great and illustrious Paul, here again to talk about all things going on in the world geopolitically, financially, economically, and the like. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion, and I think it's time we delve into Western financial status right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's one of these situations where people feel that what we've seen really since 2008 can just continue forever. And yeah, they can keep printing money. Yes, of course they can keep printing money, but it has consequences. You can't just keep doing it and thinking that this is just this endless gravy train. At some point, it's going to break the financial system, and also, of course, we're seeing the consequences particularly since the pandemic, of what the money printing's done, and in a broader sense, how economic and financial reality is crushing the illusion. And really, the United Kingdom is a great example of this. And obviously, what's quite telling is we're not here to discuss the election and the whole mythical nature of Western politics and the idea that voting for one party is going to change anything. But obviously, Starmer's Labour Party won the election. The only interesting point is, in percentage terms, the number of votes they got was very low, but they won with a huge majority, and a lot of that really was to do with the fact, in an aggregate terms of votes, this Reform Party took millions of votes away from the Conservative Party, and that's why they got trounced effectively, and why. So, but that's to do with first past the post politics and not proportional representation. But it's just a small point worth making, that it wasn't so much a resounding desire for people to have a Labour government. It's just how first past the post works sometimes. Yeah, there was tactical voting going on by people who wanted the Conservatives out of government after being in since 2010. But what's very interesting is, and there was a statement came out a couple of weeks ago, not long after the election, where the Labour just came out and basically said Britain's bankrupt, and there's major crises in everything, in healthcare, in they didn't talk about the economy in a broad sense or the financial system, but key things like healthcare and transportation and a myriad of other sectors going, look, it's not one crisis. We've got this enormous black hole. We're going to have to, and okay, the argument is that then the whole idea, are they going to have austerity put in place to make up this black hole? But what they were basically admitting is what we know is the case across all of Europe, that Europe's bankrupt and the financial systems are completely broken. And it's actually something, whilst I have no interest in politics, I've always said that when governments take over, they should tell the truth. And if they're a serious government, and say, well, actually, we're just going to tell you we're bankrupt. We're not going to hide the fact. Whereas the previous governments never admitted this. They've come out, okay, maybe the argument is they're doing it to justify policy decisions. But this raises enormous amounts of questions as to what are they going to do to remedy this problem. Now, okay, the whole subject of energy is part of that component. UK tended to be a nation that didn't, relative terms, import that much cheap Russian energy, which it should have done, but it's a problem going forward for them. It's a problem in who's going to finance new growth in the economy, and where's the money coming from? Because there's nowhere in the West that can do this. So, and there is a stark realization of the severity of the problem, and certainly the Western countries are now starting to fear, well, what's the risk of a backlash from the people as economies create more and more, and obviously job prospects obviously diminish, and all the things that they previously never thought was going to be an issue, they now know it's going to be an issue. But Of course, the problem is, and what Western governments always do, is go, well, we've got to have spending cut. So we're going to cut spending here and here and here. And it is going to disadvantage the poorest people, but it's also going to hammer the so-called middle class, which is a huge amount of people in Western nations there. And if you're going to really hammer them at precisely the wrong point in time, then you risk having societal meltdown is probably the wrong word, but breakdown or societal unrest, or society being very angry with government policy. Seems like quite a lot of people are already quite angry with Labour, even though they've only just been elected for this very reason. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. So there is no answer. They have no way of knowing what to do. They're not going to go to the Russians now and go, we need cheap energy. When in China, we need your investment, because they joined the whole nonsense coming out of Washington about China. And, you know, they just parrot whatever the United States has said about China. So all human rights records nonsense that Xinjiang being one example, which is a complete lie. And, you know, saying China's just stealing technology, and China is effectively saturating the market with cheap subsidized goods, which is not true. They're not subsidized. They don't have the inflationary problem yet. The cost of living matrix is much lower. They're able to produce things much cheaper, as we know and we've said previously. So it's quite refreshing to hear a government, in inverted commas, making these statements, but also it's indicative of a far broader problem that, you know, we're seeing more and more companies go to the wall. We're seeing more and more broader financial problems in Western countries, and there is no answer, there is no solution to it. And also, of course, it's very telling, and okay, people can argue about how they define what this means, but for the first time in UK history, the UK fell out of the top 10 leading countries in the world for industrial production. And of course, as they fell out the top 10, Russia climbed in the top 10. This is the irony of sanctioning, where sanctions have blown up completely in the West face. And of course, the other big problem is the West's desire to embrace the so-called climate change green revolution, which is disastrous for Western economies. As that's self-explanatory. You'll just look at Germany. Germany is a classic reason why, when you don't have cheap Russian energy, you're in serious trouble. So it's certainly an interesting situation with regards to what the UK does next, because it desperately needs massive investment that it's not going to get, because the only countries that will invest in the West would be Chinese, and to some extent Russia could in energy terms. And here's the big difference, because the West constantly tries to pick holes in, like, the Chinese economy, which is nonsense, but also the Russian economy. And Russia had to raise interest rates recently to 18%. Why? Because its economy is actually genuinely overheating. Unlike the West, where inflation was caused by massive money printing, Russia doesn't print money. And all the ongoing structural issues that we know means inflation's far higher than they're admitting to. But in recent times, real wages in Russia increased by 14%. And also the consumption of goods and services increased by 25%. I mean, so much for sanctions and crippling Russia, and Russia would have no goods and services to sell. The unemployment rate, which was 8% in 2022, is now at a record low, 2.6%. So what Russia's done extremely well out of sanctions imposed on it, and we've discussed all that before. But you know, we can go back over that at some point in the future. But what it proves is that Russia has got an overheated economy, which is causing inflation, and therefore they're going, we need to do something about it to try and tame inflation that's grown. But it's largely to do with the fact people are being paid higher wages and they're consuming more goods. I mean, so yes, it's inflation, but it's not like the mythical inflation we have, where they keep trying to tell us our inflation is caused by an overheating, our economy is too strong. There's no strength in Western economies because all they're trying to do is hide the fact that, like Germany, which is just rapidly deindustrializing with enormous redundancies in the process, but also because of the financialization of Western economies. And of course, that's something that Russia has no such problems with. So it's good just to mention Russia and recent data that's come out to contrast the difference between their economy, despite all the sanctions. And the UK is one example, and we can talk about some of the nations you mentioned, obviously, before we came on about Italy. And I think that's an interesting discussion point with regards to how Maloney's changing attitudes with respect to China.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another one who's actually at least a little bit come out with transparency, and that's Mélenchon in France. He is pretty much laying out the fact that what's going, the conflict going on in Israel, the conflict in Ukraine. He hasn't really talked about any of the energy problems that France has brought upon itself, but he at least is recognizing, and you never know if radicals like Mélenchon are doing it for political purposes. Trying to say, hey, look, this is what the conservative capitalistic mindset does and is, and here's laying out what's been hidden from you. You take that with a grain of salt, because Mélenchon, pure and simple, is a radical socialist who wants to tax everybody into oblivion for whatever policies and programs they want to do. However, getting back to Britain real quick, every single thing, every single pebble that you throw into a pond has consequences. It may not be immediate in front of you. It may be not even midterm. But Britain has never really solved the problem of what they would do following Brexit. They had the opportunity when they disconnected from Europe and reliance upon the continent to then make agreements with China or Russia or whoever, but they chose not to, because obviously they are still under the thumb of the United States, and they are still under the many politicians are under the thumb of following the policies of of Davos. And while Davos may not have as much control as many of the conspiracy theorists like to believe, it's the equivalent of what Soros did by getting certain attorney generals into key positions in state governments. They can wreak a lot of havoc, which they have done, letting criminals go free, not even bothering with bail. And you can see what it's doing in the United States. To me, a whole line, the saddest part is, now that we have the chance to look hindsight, Liz Truss in some ways wasn't as bad as she was made out to be.
Well, actually, ironically, she was quite right about a lot of things.
She was, but the problem is when you have the media completely against you, you're in complete opposition to what your neocon party wants to do. They're going to vilify you and pretty much destroy your credibility. And you have to wait a number of years down the road before you can say, look, I was right, and people will actually listen to you.
Well, yeah, there is an irony. The other irony is in the recent general election in the UK, she actually lost her seat, so she's not even an MP anymore. I mean, how could someone in such a short space of time go from being a prime minister, albeit very briefly, to not even a member of parliament? But the problem is, and this is where it highlighted, fact is, yeah, okay, you're right, I'm not agreeing with everything that Truss said, but the interesting point was, effectively, it caused financial turmoil. And the bond markets just had a fit basically, and it could have taken everything down, and they had to Bank of England had to step in and remedy the problem, and that was just unacceptable. And of course, ultimately, trust paid the price. But this is the thing where financialization of economies means that if politicians come out, even if what they say is factually correct, okay, maybe not all of it, but aspect or the broader point they're making is correct, the risk is they can upend the financial system. I mean, this is the thing. You imagine if you came out with a comment that was true, but it actually caused turmoil in bond markets, given how fragile bond markets are anyway. Everyone start dumping, whether it's gilts or treasuries or whatever else, it can upend the financial system and blow everything up. And that's what financialization does. And therefore you can't really come out and tell the truth about anything. So it's kind of interesting that Labour came out in the UK and made these comments. Yeah, to some extent, Truss was right, but again, it's the saying it and acting on it. You can't do this anymore because the risk to the broader financial system and given the West totally depends on financialization. Although, of course, that is now going to break down and is going to be irretrievable in the future, which then creates a whole other set of problems because we need to have economies in the West that are actually built on sound principles. So we actually do produce stuff and we sell it. And that then comes back to this whole interesting point. And at some point, we're going to talk about the US and the challenges the US faces, not just ongoing internationally, but also domestically. And they're enormous because people will say, we're going to reindustrialize the United States. Well, I'm in agreement with that, but there's all this simplistic idea. You could inflate debt away when you can't, because you just, I mean, as we keep saying, the United States' debt burden just grows and grows and grows, and inflation's accelerated that. Because unless you have an economy where you balance your budget, and then you can start perhaps using some measure of inflation to control the debt growth, you're not going to. It's just going to grow exponentially. And also, the other basic point is, for the United States to produce goods, it's going to have to produce them that's competitive. So it can sell them to the rest of the world. Otherwise, the rest of the world's going to go, well, I'm going to go to Africa, or I'm going to go to Southeast Asia, including the Chinese. Maybe I'll buy it from the Russians. I'm going to buy it from everyone else because it's much cheaper. And the other problem is, you could say, well, we'll service the domestic economy. But, if the domestic economy used to buy a widget from, via imports, and the widget used to cost, I don't know, €1, and now the widget costs €4, people can't afford to pay it. And you're going to cause inflationary problems because everyone's going to go, well, I need to be paid a lot more because everything costs more now for me to buy, whether it's goods and services in my country. So it's an enormous problem. And the UK staring down the barrel of a gun, as is the rest of Europe. I mean, they're all trying to pretend everything's okay, but Germany's in serious trouble. France is in serious trouble. Italy is. I mean, we came back not that long ago from being on holiday in Italy, and, it was very quiet. It wasn't particularly busy anywhere. I mean, and you could see, financially, you could see where inflation's kicked in. In the service sector, everything costs a lot more than it would have done 2 or 3 years ago. And this has consequences. And we've reached a point where it's completely unsustainable. And the question is, when do other nations have to come out and admit this? But I think this is a calculated gamble because, again, governments in the West are not run by political parties, and no, they're not run by all the people everyone keeps mentioning. That's not true either. But the question is, this is a calculated gamble in the UK to tell people we're in serious trouble, and we need to tell you we're in serious trouble. Why are they doing that? Because they know this time the serious trouble is something they can't paper over with some miraculous policy that kicks the can down the road. So they're kind of preempting people, going, it's going to get extremely difficult, without being too brutal about their assessment. But it's the question, when does Germany have to admit this in totality? Although there's been some admission about it, and France and Italy. I mean, they're the three biggest economies in Europe, and it's the same. I've increasingly seeing it from people in the Netherlands, where they're all going, our economy's in trouble. I've never heard people talk like that. And they go, and they understand why it's in trouble, and they're seeing the real world problems, because reality is killing the illusion. And I think it's just the start of a very, very difficult period, where we've always said that the reality will kill the illusion, and really, ironically, the pandemic was the catalyst. And I said at the time, this will be the catalyst, but it's for reality killing the illusion, and it's certainly happening. And there's no way out of this mess. So, the question is, eventually, when economies get so weak, and the job market or job sectors, or all the sectors, job markets collapse, huge unemployment, they're not going to sit there and go, well, we can't bail anyone out or support people, because that's exactly what they did when they had the pandemic, as they panicked that the masses would revolt, and they're going to go through the risk of that happening. And again, their answer to it will have to be to bail everyone out. And I know what's going to happen when that happens. All these people can go, see, we told you, they're going to get everyone. So they're all earning, effectively, losing their jobs. They're all going to be paid unemployment benefit and other benefits. And this is part of this deliberate plan. No, it isn't. There's no deliberate plan. It's just a consequence of failed economic and financial policies that's been going on since financialization. That's just a convenient excuse to say this is the reason why it's happening. It's not. It's happening because of failed policy decisions, and decisions they made to say we're going to crush Russia economically and financially, and it failed, and Russia's gone from strength to strength, and in the process, it's cost Western economies trillions, pounds, euros, Swiss francs, whatever you want to denominate the currency. That was just a very spectacularly bad policy decision that's blown up in their face. And the day the war started, I said, if they implement these sanctions, they'll blow themselves up. But they can't see this, because, again, it's this idea, that we're the West and we're invincible and we can crush anyone and everyone, and we're going to crush Russia, and it failed. And now they've got the spectre of what happens with the Ukraine war, because they're going to have to admit Ukraine's lost. Then everyone's going to turn around and go, well, hang on. You told us they'd win. And by the way, you've spent trillions or hundreds of billions of dollars on a failed war that should have been spent on us. Oh, and by the way, you've cost our economy trillions of euros, dollars, pounds, whatever, and you've blown everything up. And they're going to be furious. And these politicians will have nowhere to hide. So hence why I said von der Leyen get re-elected might annoy people. But in a way, it's fine, because when it all blows up, she's going to be in office. She'll have to take responsibility and accountability to explain her role in the Ukraine war, and telling us all it was the right decision, and how we would crush Russia into oblivion, and Ukraine would triumph and win the war. Well, none of that's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, we got a couple minutes left here. Probably good to touch on Maloney, who just a couple months ago, I think it was within a couple months, made a big deal about cutting off the Belt and Road agreements that Italy had with China to bring the Belt and Road into Europe. And now all of a sudden she's had an about face. I don't think it's necessarily a completely economic situation, but what, in your opinion, do you think would be the reason she would, after being all gung-ho to Brussels, now all of a sudden looking out for her own best interest, or at least her nation's best interest.
Yeah, I mean, just a little bit of history. We talked when Maloney was elected, everyone said, oh, Maloney's going to transform the European Union. She's going to stick it to the European Union and to NATO. And I said, no, none of that will happen. Yeah, Maloney is pro Italy as a nation, but undoubtedly, and if you saw Maloney before she was elected, she said all the sensible things. She understood reality. She challenged concepts. I think this is what gave people encouragement. The usual problem happens when a Western leader like that gets elected. The first meeting is they're told, right, well, I hate to tell you this, but you might be the president now, or you might be the prime minister, whichever country it is, but you don't really have any power. In fact, here's the thing, you're going to do nothing to rock the NATO boat. You're going to do nothing to rock the European Commission or the European Union. You're going to do nothing that upsets or rocks the ECB or the Federal Reserve, meaning the Western financial system. And go back to the point of trust, rocking the boat and paying the big price for it. And you're not going to do anything to upset Wall Street too much. And you want to make some small internal policy decisions, as long as it doesn't upend any of the things we've just mentioned, no problem. But if you do any of these things, you're finished. Politically, it's over. You're going to end up being removed from office one way or the other. And that's the kind of conversation. So Maloney gets into office and goes, well, I can't do anything. So you're right, what's changed? Well, what was interesting is if you saw some of the body language in the last couple of months, when you've seen Maloney around the European leaders, you can see she's totally exasperated by things. Also, the process of how people are elected in inverted commas or re-elected, like von der Leyen, etc. She was very unhappy with that process, how it works, because we all know it's not a democracy. They claim it's a democracy, but it isn't. I mean, the people have no say in it, and the voting process is clearly, people are probably bullied into voting to ensure von der Leyen gets re-elected, as one example. Or enough people are bullied so she wins. But I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, and we're back to Maloney, who does care about a nation state and the Italian people. And I think her government looked at this and gone, we like I said to you, Italy's in serious trouble. Its economy is going to a wall. I mean, its debt market's been precarious for quite a long time. And there's a realization the European Union doesn't do anything. And it's not there to do anything. It's just a vehicle for Washington to control Europe over foreign policy decisions. And again, not doing anything that might impact the European Union or the Federal Reserve or the general broader Western financial system. Remember, these are all known. You can't do any of those. Don't dare rock the boat. Don't do anything. So I think it's the realization of going, well, I was effectively advised when I came into office, you need to turn your back on China because China's going to steal all your assets. It's going to steal all your intellectual property. It's here to screw you over. Not going, hang on a minute. That's exactly what the European Union is screwing nations over and not allowing them to be sovereign nations. And for realizing we need investment in the future. So we're going to need lots of cheap energy. We're going to need Chinese investment. So the realization that is, well, I think we're going to have to go back, not so much with a begging bowl, but go to China. And even having left the Belt Road Initiative, they didn't slam the door on China. And China's quite happy with the Belt Road for you to go, well, I'm not happy about this investment criteria anymore. We need to change it. They go, okay, let's change it. So effectively what's happened is they've left the Belt Road and they've realized that's not reality. They haven't slammed the door on China, and now they're wanting to open the door again. And they've signed a 3-year cooperation agreement, which basically is rejoining the Belt Road Initiative without joining. It's just, semantics. It's like, well, we're not really in it. but we are in it, and it's because they need massive Chinese investment. They're going to need huge amounts of cheap energy in the future, and because Italy's is in serious trouble, and then of course Italy also has suffered with migration issues, which is caused problems because the first port of call from people coming from North Africa has been Sicily and then the Italian mainland. So they're equally concerned about things like that. It's not a question that Italy is going to leave the European Union. It's not. Or Italy is going to jettison NATO. It's not. But there are nations in Europe in varying degrees of realization. The most obvious ones who understand exactly the reality is Orban from Hungary and obviously Fico, they tried to, there was an assassination attempt. I don't think anyone believes it was a hit job from some government, but certainly someone. It's very difficult to know exactly what happened, but he understands the reality. I think the Austrians do to a significant extent, and I think the Italians do. I think privately, a lot of nations realise the world's changing and the European Union in serious trouble, and this is part of why Russia is a collective and weren't trying to engage with the European Union anymore. But what they are prepared to do is go, well, we can engage with individual nations. It's not picking nations off for their benefit. We know we can work with the Hungarians and the Slovakians. Okay, maybe in the future we can do a bit more with the Austrians. And it's working in bilateral sense, not a multilateral format. It's impossible because Europe will immediately just get involved and just destroy any hope of that being realized. But I think Italy has just had the wake up call going, well, there's the Europe's finished. There's no investment opportunity. And we need to realize in Italy, we need infrastructure building. We need all these things so we can then put industry in place and we can be competitive. And there is a big market because Italy produces some really good stuff. And historically it has done. And there's actually a market for it in China. Chinese people like buying high quality and Italian goods like Italian shoes and clothes and things. So there is a market for things where it can be reciprocated. So it's not all just one-way traffic. But yes, of course, Maloney's going to turn up and make some statements about, well, we're not very happy that you're supporting Russia. With the Ukraine war, and this has caused a bit of angst. And of course, she has to say those things, so she sounds like she's towing the line. But a lot of it's just very positive statements. And I think one other interesting point is who wants to restore diplomatic ties? The Syrians, the Italians, of all people. So these are big statements being made. And as I made a post on X the other day, it's not all encompassing, but there's this slow realization from the Italians that they're starting to implement some of the things that people originally saw Maloney to have promised as a leader who might buck the trend. We're back to that point. No leader at the moment can buck the trend, whether it's in Europe and for that matter, the United States. I mean, that the whole discussion of Trump, I think, is something we can talk about in the future as well. I think there's some very interesting points to discuss in that regard. But the idea that you're going to have a president who's going to have control in the United States is a nonsense. And that's just a statement of fact. Now, can that change in the future? Potentially. Is the ways to change it partially? Maybe so. But historically, like the idea that the Biden administration's run by Obama. No, it's not, because Obama was just a puppet doing as he was told. He didn't run his own administration. He's not running the Biden administration. There are far more intricate parties who are involved in dictating policy decisions, not least the military-industrial complex is one clear example. But Italy's interesting, and it's Orban's come out and made some very telling statements in recent times. But there's 27 nations in the EU. It's going to take a long time, and some of them are it's going to be to the bitter end before they accept the reality that the unipolarity is dead and it's over, and they have to embrace multipolarity. And then question is Russia going to trust them? And even if Russia trusts them, well, where's the Russian energy they so desperately need going to be made available? Probably not. So Europe faces a very precarious situation. And here's the thing, Italy might be looking at this going, well, we can make friends again properly with China and build the relationship with them. And maybe that in the future will give us a door into the Russians, and obviously changing our relationship with them in the future, maybe sooner than other nations. Like, I mean, France, Germany particularly, even though of course Germany desperately needs Russia for energy, amongst other things, is the last nation that's going to go with a begging bowl to the Russians. But again, it's just opportunism to try and realize where the future is and have to start to try and make some changes. I mean, it's one thing be behest to the Americans as a European leader, but it's another thing when you're facing tens or millions of people in your own country who are furious with your policy decisions. Then who do you fear more, your people or the United States? And the argument is that you're going to have to be more fearful and concerned about how people in your own country are going to respond to your policy decisions than worrying about what the Americans may or may not do, because soon enough, the United States is going to have far too much to deal with internally than worrying about what's going on in Italy, or for that matter, the Ukraine or Israel or anywhere else.
Exactly. And just on a final note, perhaps Maloney is learning from what the dirty little secret of the Reagan years, the Reagan economy recovery in the 80s. Many think it was because of tackling inflation. No, it was because of Japan, the rise of Japan and Japanese investment. That's something that Europe really needs to take into consideration. Anyway,
Yeah, very much so.
Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this discussion.
And thank you too.
And to everybody out here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell. And we will be back soon with another topic.